Alrighty, welcome to the project. In this one, we're going to be looking at form validation. So we're going to start by learning about forms and input elements and how HTML has some validation built into it. We're then going to fill in the gaps in that validation with some JavaScript. The goal of this project is to show one way to validate, and keep in mind we're only validating on the front end. This isn't a full stack course, so learning about back-end validation will not be covered in this project or in this course. So you can see here that we have a sign-up form, and you can see that we have red outlines around each of the input fields. And if we were to just register this, we can see that we have a little popover asking us to please fill out the field. So I'm going to do that. And you can see once I fill out a field, that it becomes green. And you can see here that we want a phone number in a specific format. And we have an email address here. Again, this is a specific format. If I were to remove the @ sign, you can see that it turns red. So that is the email form actually validating that for us. For the phone number, we've provided our own pattern for validation. Next, we want a website URL. So I'm going to put in my own website here. If we were to get rid of the HTTP, you can see that it's no longer valid. That is, again, the input of type URL that's validating that for us. And then lastly, we're going to create a password here. So we need an 8-character password that contains one capital letter and one number. And you can see that I've done that, but if I were to just type something that's 8 characters, but it doesn't have a number, and I try to register, you can see that it says, please match the requested format. Please include at least one uppercase, one lowercase, one number. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to add that number. Now it's green again. And now I'm going to enter in another password, but this one is going to be a different number. You can see that it turns green here, but then if I try to register, you can see they turn red again, and we have a message down here. Make sure your passwords match. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to change that number, click register, and you can see that the fields turn green and the message at the bottom is now successfully registered. And we're going to go over to our console, and we see that we have an object here. We only have one object here. So when we tried to register with the wrong passwords, it did not pass the data. It's only going to pass the data when all of our validation has passed. And you can see we have each of our fields here. This is just a console log, but in a real application, you would be sending this object to a database somewhere. But I just wanted to show that the data was going somewhere once it had been validated. All right, so that's pretty much it for the description of the project. Let's get started. Alrighty, so welcome to the project. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to copy our template folder. And we're going to paste it in here, and we're going to rename it to be form-validation. And then we're going to open that up in Visual Studio Code. So we're going to click Open Folder, and we're going to open Form Validation. Okay, so we can see that we have our 3 files here, and we're in our index.html. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the title to be Form Validation. And then we're going to save that, and we're going to use our Go Live server here. And you can see we have the project up and running with our title in place. What we're going to be doing essentially is creating a sign-up form. This is going to be inside of a div at the middle of the center of our page. But before we get to that, let's have a little bit of an explanation about forms in HTML, because that's what we're wrapping all of our content in. So an HTML form is used to collect user input, and then it can be sent to a server for processing. So this example is just having first name and then a last name. So we have a label, an input, and then a submit button. So we have a form as a parent element, and then we have our inputs, as many as we want, inside of the form element. So that's important. And you can see that the input elements are the most important part of the form element, because this is what is actually taking in the values. So The default type is text, so that would be something where you're just entering a name or something like that. And you can see in this example here that we have a label and then an input and then a label and then an input. If we scroll down, we can see a little bit more of an explanation on labels. Again, notice the label element in the example above. The label tag defines a label for many form elements. It is useful for screen reader users because the screen reader will read out the label out loud when the user is focused on the input element. That's the reason we're going to use it, is for accessibility. All right, so I think we've learned enough about forms. Let's dive in a little bit more on the input elements themselves. So the input element is used to create interactive web-based forms in order to accept user data, as we've discussed. And if we go down, we can see that there's an example here. We have a type of text for this input here. We have an ID. We have the label for with the matching ID. We also have a name. So we'll talk about this a little bit later on. But the name is going to be useful for actually getting the value from this specific input. And you can see we have another couple of attributes here. So if we scroll down and look at input types, there are many different types of inputs. You can even have something like a color picker, which we're going to show a little later on in the course. For our purposes, we are going to be using an email type. So this will have validation parameters built in to verify if an email address is valid. And we're also going to be using password, where the value is obscured. So if I type in here, you can see it shows the dots instead of showing the actual characters I'm typing in. We're also going to use the telephone type. So again, this is going to validate the telephone input. We're going to use the text input, which is the default. And we're also going to use the URL input, which again is going to validate to make sure that it's a valid URL. So beyond that, we can actually also add attributes to our input element. So we'll get into this a little bit later on, but we are going to be interested in adding things like max length and min length in order to help provide some validation. And again, we're going to use the name attribute because this allows the form input to store as a name value pair. And we're also going to use required to state that a certain input is required to be used. And that's about it. All right. Now that we have an understanding of forms and inputs, let's actually get started building out our HTML. We're not going to worry about the validation just yet. We're just going to start with the basics. So the first thing we're going to do is, if we Alt-Z for our word wrap, we can get rid of our Font Awesome link here because we're not going to be using any icons in this project. And I'm going to turn off word wrap again. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have a div. And I'm going to use the autocomplete here to just add a class using period, and the class name is going to be container. And I'm going to press enter to make a div with the class container. And then inside of this, we're going to start by having an h1. And this is just going to say sign up today. And then inside of this, we're going to comment out a title for our form. And we're going to create our form with the ID, so hashtag of form. And we're not going to worry about the action because we're going to have a button inside of our form that is going to perform that action for us. So inside of here, we're going to start by having our inputs. So the first thing we're going to have is our full name. We want the user's full name. And each of these inputs is going to be wrapped in a parent div in order for us to style the height of each of these to make sure that they are nice and spread out. So I'm going to create a div.form-group to create a div with the class form-group. And then I'm going to have a label. And this is going to be for our name. and the label itself is going to read full name. And then below that, I'm going to create my input, and I'm going to give it an ID of name. So again, make sure that your label for property is matching the ID of the input, as I have here. One other thing I'm going to add to this is a placeholder. So this is going to show up before the user enters in information, just as a further prompt. Okay, so that's it for this. I'm actually going to copy this just to make it a little bit easier. And the next one is going to be our phone number. And I can paste this in. And we're going to change this here to be phone. And this is going to be phone number. The type of input is actually going to switch from text to be tel for telephone number. And the ID is going to be phone. And the placeholder is going to be the format that we want to achieve. We're not going to worry about the validation for that just yet. We just want to have a placeholder there for now. Okay, moving on to the next one. This is going to be our email address. Okay, I can paste this in. And I can actually use a neat function within Visual Studio Code. This is to select multiple of the same thing. It would be either Control D on Windows, I believe, or Command D on a Mac. So you see I'm pressing it and I'm selecting multiple things. I have multiple cursors. So I'm going to switch this to be email. So you can see I've changed the label for and the ID to email. I'm going to change the label itself though to be email address. And I'm going to change the placeholder to just have the format email@address.com. Perfect. Going to move on next to the, oh, I almost forgot. We want to change the type from text to be email. Okay, and now moving on to our website URL. And I'm going to paste this in here. I'm going to do the same thing again. And this is going to be for our website. And then the type, I'm going to change it first so I don't forget, is going to be of URL. So again, the type email and URL are going to provide some special validation built right into the input. We'll get to that in a later video. So we'll switch this, website URL, and we're going to change the placeholder. I'm just going to put in my website here. Okay, and we're going to go down, only 2 more left, our passwords. So I'm going to comment out a title for our password, scroll down a bit, and we can paste this in, and we're going to change this. So in this case, we are going to need to specify, because we have more than one password, so I'm going to put in password 1. For this, text value here for our label, just going to make it password, and I'm going to change the type to be password, and the placeholder is going to just be create password. Okay, so I'm actually going to copy this because our next one is going to be similar to this one. And we're going to comment out another title. This is going to be for confirm password. Then we'll paste that in there. And so for this one, we're going to change password 1 to be password 2. Make sure the ID matches. And this title is actually going to change to be confirm password. The type password will stay the same, but our placeholder will also change to be confirm password. Okay, so we're done with our inputs. The very last thing we need within our form is going to be a button. This is going to act as our submit button. So we're going to need to give it a type of submit. So that's what's going to submit our form. And we're going to give it the label or text of register. And the very last thing outside of our form itself, still within our container though, so this closing div is for our container, we want to have a error success message here. I'm going to comment out a title, error/success message. And then inside of this, we're going to create a div dot message dash container. And then inside of this, we're going to have an h3 hashtag message. So it's an h3 with the ID of message. We're giving this an ID because we're going to change this value. And we are going to say, don't hesitate. So this will be the opening message. But if we have a validation error, this will change to an error message. Or if we've submitted the form correctly, this will change to a success message. All right, so let's save that and jump over and we can check it out. Okay, so we have everything here. We have our placeholders within our inputs. We have our button here, and we have our don't hesitate at the bottom. All right, so it's good that everything's built, but of course we have zero styling. So that's what we'll focus on in the next video. We're going to jump into our CSS. All right, I'll see you in that one. Bye for now. Alrighty, welcome back. In this one, we're going to focus on styling the form. It could definitely look better and fill the space a lot better than it currently is. We want the inputs to be the full width. We want the labels to be above on a different line. And we want to have, again, the balanced blank space on the left and the right. So let's jump back to our styling. And below this here, we're going to start by commenting out a title for our form. And we're going to start with our form element itself. We want this to have a width of 90%. So that's going to give 5% on the left, 5% on the right. Next, we're going to style our form group. So this is the parent div that's wrapping each of our labels and inputs. And we're going to give this a height of 65 pixels. So we can spread out our label and our input from each other. Next, we're going to style our label. And we're going to give this a position relative to allow us to add a little bit more space on the bottom so that the label is not right on top of the input. So we're going to give that a bottom of 3 pixels. And we can scroll down here. And now we're going to target our input element. And we're going to give it a width of 100%, height of 34 pixels, padding of 5 pixels, border of 1 pixel solid black, a border radius of 5 pixels, and lastly, we're going to give it an outline of none, because when we click on it, we don't want there to be an outline because we're going to use the border to change colors depending on if it's valid or invalid. We'll get to that in a moment. But let's save that and check it out. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Definitely a step in the right direction. But this is a great time to showcase and explain the benefits of box sizing border box. This is something that we always put in our HTML, but in this case, we're going to assign it to our input element. So as I said before, we have a width of 90%, which means we should have an even space on the left and right. You can see that there's less space on the right here. We've added a padding of 5 pixels to the input itself, and that is pushing the width of our input beyond the 100% width that we had set for it. So in order to fix this, we can go back, and this is the padding I was referring to. Instead of changing that, we can just go box sizing border box. So what that means is it's going to ignore this padding spacing, and it's not going to allow the width to be more than 100%. So without this, the width is 100% plus the 10 pixels, 5 from the left, 5 from the right, that is pushing it to be more than 100%. Okay, but let's save it now and jump back, and we can see that the spacing, the padding overall is a whole lot better. We have an even padding on our left and our right here, and our top to bottom value has also been adjusted as well. Okay, so that's looking a whole lot better. The next thing we're going to talk about is going to be the valid pseudo class. So the valid pseudo class is something that's going to be added on our input element here, and it will allow us to change any kind of property. In our case, we're actually going to change the border instead of the background. and it's going to change to be valid or invalid depending on if the form itself validates the field successfully or unsuccessfully. So that's more or less all we need to know about that. So let's jump back to our CSS. The other thing we're going to add, so we're going to add this first, actually. So input pseudoclass valid. So input : valid. And we're going to change the border. It's going to still be 1 pixel solid, but it's going to be green if it's valid. You can change to use a different color if you would like. And I'm going to do a similar thing for our invalid pseudoclass. And this border is going to be 1 pixel solid red. So you can see that we have an initial value of black, and these also can change back and forth. So we're just going to also add a transition of all, so all of our changes, and we're going to give this a 0.3 second duration so that instead of instantly flipping from one color into another, it will do it in 0.3 seconds. So if we save that and jump back and check, we can see now that all of our fields are green, meaning that for the moment, everything is valid. But that's only because we have not actually started to implement any of our HTML validation, but we're going to talk about that in the next video. For now, let's finish up the rest of our styling, and we're going to start with the next thing on our list, which is our button. So let's jump back and take care of that. So the button itself, I'm going to add a lot of different styling on this. You can style your button however you would like. But the first thing I'm going to add is cursor pointer so that you have the glove whenever you hover over the button. For some reason, it doesn't do that by default, which is kind of surprising. And we're going to give it a color white. So that's going to make the text inside the button white. And I'm just going to give it a background color of black. So the background of the button will be black. And I don't want a border, so border none. I want a border radius of 5 pixels, so that's going to give it the rounded corners. I want a height of 50 pixels. I want a width of 100% of the space. So remember that the form, which is the parent element, is a width of 90%. So we'll still have that space on the left and right. And I explicitly have to enter in the font family again. As I said, the buttons and inputs have their own default fonts. So if you want to override them, you will have to add in the font family again. This time, I'm going to give it a font size of 20 pixels. I'm going to add back the letter spacing I had of 2 pixels. And I'm just going to give it a margin top of 5 pixels. Okay, let's save. Check that out. All right. So that is definitely a nice looking button. So if we click on it, you can see closely that there's a blue outline that's kind of happening here. So we actually want to get rid of that. And also, when we hover over the button, you can see that our cursor changes from a black default cursor to a white glove. We want to also change the color and the brightness of the button to have an extra indication that it's something that can be clicked. So we're going to take care of both of those things with our pseudo classes here. So right below, we're going to start with the button : hover pseudo class. And for this, I'm going to use a trick called filter brightness. So this is going to change the brightness of the button. Because our color is black, it's not going to do as much as it normally would, but it's still going to brighten the text of register. So I'm going to give it a brightness of 200%, so it's going to be twice as bright. And I'm also going to shift the background color. So instead of having it be black, I'm going to change it using the provided color palette within Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to change it to just be a little bit lighter. So this is our original color, and this is our current color, so you can compare them. That is, I think, lighter enough, but it's still pretty dark. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to target the focus pseudo class, and we're going to say outline none, because we don't want that blue outline on our button. Okay, so let's save that and check it out. Okay, so you can see as I hover over it that the color changes. Perfect. And you can see now when I click on the button that we don't have any outline there. All right, perfect. So that's working. The very last thing we want to style is our message itself. So we're going to go back and take care of that. Below our button here, we're going to target our .message dash container, curly brackets here, and we're going to give it a border of 1 pixel solid black. So we're going to do a similar thing that we're doing with our validation pseudo class. It's going to change to be green or red, but because this is not an input, we can't use the valid pseudo class. We're going to need to later on actually change this within our JavaScript, but we'll get to that later on. Next, we're going to give it a border radius of 5 pixels. We're going to give it a width 90%. So remember, this is actually outside of our form, so that's why we have to give it a width of 90% instead of 100% like our other items. We're going to give it a margin top of 20 pixels, and we're going to give it a display flex and justify content center to center everything horizontally. And lastly, we want the text color to be black as well. This is something we will also change in our JavaScript. Okay, so let's save that and check it out. All right, so that's looking excellent. Everything is fitting very nicely. We have an even spacing at the bottom and on the left here and between here. All right, that's looking excellent. All right, so that's it for the CSS. In the next video, I'm going to get to talking about the actual HTML form validation that we have built in to our form element. All right, I'll see you in that one. Bye for now. Alrighty, welcome back. So now we're going to dive into some form validation, starting with what's built into HTML. So of course, I'll provide a link to all of these things within the course. And in this first one here, we are seeing that there are different types of client-side validation. So there are 2 main types. That is the built-in form validation using HTML5 that we're going to talk about in this video. And then there's also validation that can be coded into JavaScript. So this is completely customizable, but you need to create it all. Whereas the validation in HTML5 is actually built in to the elements themselves. So if we scroll down, we can see using built-in form validation is an important part of HTML5 form controls. And this can be done by adding validation attributes on different form elements. So specifically, our inputs. So an overview of the main things that we can add is required. So it means that the form needs to be filled out before the form can be submitted. A minimum and maximum length, which is pretty straightforward. And the type itself can actually validate for us, as I mentioned, the email address and URL. And lastly, we can use a pattern to specify a regular expression that defines a certain format that the data must be entered in. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But the first thing we're going to do is the easiest one, which is adding required to each of our inputs. So let's do that first. So we're going to jump back to our HTML here. We're going to scroll back up, and we are going to actually break this up a little bit just because we're going to add a lot of other things here. So we're just going to press enter, and we're going to go over here, and we're going to type in required. And we're going to do a similar thing with the rest of them. I'm just going to add required to each of these. Okay, so once you've added required to each of the inputs, we can save it and jump back to our code and check it out. Okay, so you can see now that every field is red instead of green because they're all invalid currently because they're empty. And if we were to click on the register button here, we can see that we have a pop-up that says, please fill out this field. So if I were to do that with just a single letter, you can see that now it flips to green because now this field is valid. Because all we're doing with the required is saying that you need to put something into the field. That brings us now to the min, max, length attributes. So for someone's name, we need to add in some more validation requirements here. So not only do we want it to be required, but we want it to have a minimum length, so min length, of, let's say, 3 characters. So it's someone's full name. It should at least be, I think, 3 characters long. And we'll also put a max length, but we don't want to put too much of a limitation, so we're going to have it at 100 characters. Okay, so we can save that and jump back and check. So now you can see if I just enter the letter J, that it remains red, but as soon as I enter in 3 characters, it becomes green. Okay, very cool. Moving on, we're going to come back to talk about our phone number a little bit later. Let's have a look at our email address and our website URL. So I'm going to go to another resource that talks about the constraint methods for validation. So again, by choosing the appropriate value for the type of the input, for example, choosing the email type, it automatically creates a constraint that checks whether the value is a valid email address. So if we go down here, we can see the example that for input type URL, the value must be an absolute URL, so that's for our website. And for our email, the value must syntactically be a valid email address, which generally has the format of username @ and then an address. So the big thing, of course, is having the @ sign. Okay, so we can jump back now, and we're going to test these 2 things out. So we actually don't need to provide any additional validation other than this, but let's test them. So let's see, if I just put in any kind of value here, it's not going to work. It's still red. But if I just put f@f.com, we can see that it is now green. Okay, perfect. And we're going to test our website URL. So if I were to just put in something like www.google.com, you can see that it is actually staying red because you need to type in the HTTP part of the web address. So hopefully this will condition people to actually paste in a URL, but I'm just going to type it out manually. So HTTP // and we're just going to put in google.com, and you can see now that it's green. Okay, perfect. So we have 3 of these sorted out. Let's actually jump back now to our phone number. So we're going to talk now about our pattern attribute. So there's another resource here that's talking about the pattern attribute. So it allows you to add basic data validation without actually having to do it within the JavaScript. It works by matching the input value against a regular expression. So a regular expression is a formalized string of characters that define a pattern. So you can see here that we have an example of a regular expression. So this is saying that it's okay to be any length as long as it includes lowercase characters, uppercase characters, just alphabet, I should say, or a number 0 to 9. So that means no special characters. So you can see that all of these values match this condition, but that these values do not match this condition because you can see we have special characters in all of these other examples. So based on this logic, I think that we could create a pattern to format the phone number ourselves. So if we look at some other examples, you can see that we can also control the amount of digits that we want and the value of the digits. Let's take care of that in our code. So we're going to go down to the phone number, and after a required, we're going to add in a pattern attribute, and this is going to be a string. So the format that we want is going to match this placeholder format here. So we want 3 numbers, a dash, 3 numbers, another dash, and then 4 numbers. So to validate for that, in square brackets, we're going to say that it has to be a number between 0 and 9. And then we're going to close the square bracket. And then in curly brackets, we're going to have the number 3 because we want 3 of those numbers. Then we're going to have a dash. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have a square bracket 0 to 9. And then same thing, curly brackets 3 because we want 3 numbers again. Then we're going to have a dash that we're expecting. And then we're going to have again 0 to 9. But then this time in our curly brackets, we're going to have 4 instead of 3. So let's save that and jump back, and test it out. So if I were to enter in 3333333333333, you can see at no point did it turn green, even though I had entered 10 numbers at some point there. But you can see now, if I enter in the number 444-444 and 4444, you can see now that the value has changed to green. Awesome. So that expression is filtering it out in the exact format that we want. The last pattern that we are concerned with now is our password pattern. So this is going to be a little bit more complicated. So instead of doing this manually, I'm going to search Google to see if someone already has a suggestion of how to validate a password. So I'm going to search for password validation pattern, regular expression, regex, as it's known. And if we scroll down, let's see what we find. Okay, so I'm familiar with this website, so I'm going to click on this one. And that looks pretty good. So this website is great because it is a way to test out the patterns that you're using. And you can save your patterns, and there's other kinds of references and resources. And if you actually hover over each part, it is telling you exactly what each part is signifying. So this is a great way to experiment and learn more about regular expressions. So for our purposes, from what I can see, we are requiring that we have at least some lowercase characters. We have some uppercase characters and other characters here, and we want to have at least 8 characters. So let's try an experiment here. So on the line below, we're just going to put lowercase and then our numbers here. Okay, so you can see it didn't match, or else it would have highlighted in blue. But if we just add one capital letter, you can see now that it matches. So we actually don't need the special character here. Some passwords require you to add a special character, but for our purposes, we're just going to keep it as simple as possible. So that means we want one uppercase at least, one lowercase at least, and one number at least. So you see, if I were to remove some of these numbers, you can see that it's still valid. But if I were to make it less than 8 characters, you can see that it's no longer valid. Okay, so we're just actually going to grab this whole thing and copy it and go back to our project here. And we're going to go down to our password here. We are going to have a pattern here, and we're just going to paste that inside. We're going to do the same thing for the password above. We can actually copy this whole thing, and we're going to paste that right there. And we can save that and now check it out. Okay, so I'm going to create a password. I'm going to have no uppercase character just to show. So I'm going to have 8 characters. I'm going to type in password and then the number 1. And you can see that it remains red. But we don't have enough of an explanation here. If we were to fill out everything else correctly, and we try to register, we can see that it says, please match the requested format. But that's not enough information to go by. So we're going to go back to our code. The first thing we're going to do here, we're actually going to change our placeholder because we want to tell people that we want a minimum of 8 characters, bracket. And also, a cool trick with the form validation built into HTML5 is that if we were to provide a title for the first password here, so title, and we're going to have the title be, please include at least one uppercase character, one lowercase character, and one number. So we'll save that and check it out, and we'll enter in all our values again. Okay, and this time, again, I'm going to use password 1, but no capital letter, so it's invalid. If I click register, you can see now that it says, please match the requested format, and then it actually uses the title that I just added to add in the rest of the information that we need. Please include at least one uppercase, one lowercase, and one number. Okay, so I'm going to flip this P to be capital, and you can see now that it is green. So that's working, which is great. But the limitation of the create password, confirm password in HTML is that if I were to type in another password that meets that pattern, so I'm going to type in capital P, password, and then the number 2, we can see that the field is green, meaning that as far as HTML is concerned, it is valid. But the problem is that these two don't match. So that's something that we're going to validate within our JavaScript. So we're going to take care of that in the next video. I'll see you in that one. Bye for now. Alrighty, so the goal of this video is going to be to validate our form a little bit further within our JavaScript. All right, so to start with, we're going to jump back to our code, and we're going to have in our script.js constants for each HTML element we want to interact with. So first, we're going to have const form equals document dot get element by ID, and we're going to, in single quotes, pass in our form. Our form element has the ID of form. Next, we're going to create one for our password1, and that's going to be equal to, same thing, document get element by ID, and password1, semicolon, and we can copy this, and we can actually use our command D to change this number in both places very quickly. And you know what, let's actually not just say password1, let's say password1L to show that it's the element, not the password value itself. Next, we're going to add one for our message container. And this time we can actually use something different here. We're going to use document query selector. And this will allow you to select the HTML element or a CSS class or anything else, even like an attribute, I believe. So we are going to use in single quotes the dot message dash container. So we are targeting the CSS class. And then last one, we're going to create a constant for our message itself. And again, this will get element by ID. And in quotes, we're going to pass in our message. So this is the text that's going to change within our message container. We can save that and jump back to the browser, and we're going to talk a little bit about the form itself and how it is being submitted. So we have a submit event that fires when a form is submitted, but you want to take note that the submit event fires on the form itself, even though we're using a button with the type of submit. So the button itself is what is going to submit the form, but the event that's fired is on the form itself. So let's handle that event within our code. We can jump back, and we're going to comment out a title for our event listener, and it's going to be on our form constant, and we're going to add event listener, and then single quotes, we're going to target the submit event, and when that event happens, we are going to launch a function called process form data, but we haven't made that yet, so let's do that now. So function, process form data, brackets, curly brackets, and now we're going to define the function. So this is actually going to pass in the event as a parameter. So we're just going to type E to represent the event, and then we're going to console log E, and then semicolon. Okay, so we can save that and check it out. And if we right-click and inspect, we're going to open up our console here, and we're going to fill out our information here. Okay, and we're going to click register, and you can see that the console flashed there for a second, but then it went away, and you can see that everything has been refreshed on the page here. So what is happening is actually the default behavior of the form. Normally, it's trying to send this data to a server somewhere, but because we're not properly doing anything with that request, it is just refreshing the entire page. So to get around this, we are going to use the prevent default event method. So if we scroll down, we can see that this can be useful when clicking on a submit button, it's going to prevent it from trying to submit the form. Because again, there is no backend to accept the form, so by default, it's just refreshing the page, which we don't want. So let's jump back to our JavaScript, and right above this, we're just going to type in prevent default. So we're running the prevent default method on our event. So if we save that, jump back, and this time we're going to fill everything out again. Okay, and I'm going to click register, and you can see now that we still have our event console logged and we have our values here. The page didn't refresh. Okay, excellent. So now we can actually go back and we can delete this console log. And what we're going to do with this function here that we're calling from our submit button is we're going to branch out into two separate pieces of functionality. The first is going to be to validate the form itself, and the second one is going to be to store the data. So if we jump back to our browser, we can see in this resource here that it talks about the process of validating using constraint API. How this works is there is a method called check validity that can be run on our form element, and this is going to return a Boolean indicating whether the element's value passes its constraints. It's related to our valid or invalid pseudoclasses. Okay, that's what we want to do, is we want to use our check validity method. So we're going to go back to the project, and we're going to go back into our code here, and we're going to comment out a title. This is going to be our method to validate our form. And we might not need a title because the method is just called validate form. Pretty straightforward. And above this, we're going to create that method. But before we do that, we're going to create a Boolean actually that is going to be global. We want to pass it through both of our validate and store data functions. So we're going to create a Boolean let is valid equals false. So by default, this Boolean will be set to false because by default, we do not have a valid form. Now we can actually create our validation function. So function validate form brackets, and then inside of this, we can comment out a title. We're using constraint API, and we're going to use our Boolean here. So is valid is going to be equal to form.check validity. So again, this method on the form will return a Boolean value, and we're actually going to console log the value of is valid after that. Okay, so we can save and check. So we're going to jump back, go here, and we're going to do everything correctly again. I really appreciate the autocomplete in Chrome. Fill out our password again. Okay, and we're going to register. So you can see because everything is green here, we are logging the value of true for our is valid variable. Excellent. But if we refresh the page, we can see that if we try to register, we see that we don't have any Boolean value happening. That's because with the default use of our form validation in HTML, it is not even letting us get to our submit event. So the submit event is only firing when all of these inputs are already valid. There is a way we can ignore this and do the validation ourselves. In JavaScript, 100%, we could ignore the form validation in HTML. So I'm going to show you how that would work. We're going to jump back to our HTML file, and we're going to go up to our form element here, and we're just going to type in the attribute no validate. You can see it will autocomplete for me if I press enter, and we can save that, and we can try it now. So even though everything is blank, I still have the opportunity to click register. So it's not preventing me from submitting the form itself, but we can see that the is valid Boolean is now false because the fields are actually not valid. You can see they're still red because they're empty. Okay, so that's how that will work. If you wanted to validate without HTML validation, you can. So for example, how you would do that is we can jump back to our JavaScript, and below our console log, we can actually remove this now. We are going to comment out a title, and this is going to be to style our main message for an error. And we are going to use our message element. So this is the actual text within our H3 at the bottom. And we're going to change the text content. So this is going to update the text within our H3. And we're going to say, please fill out all fields, period, semicolon. And then our message, we also want to change the styling. So we're going to go message.style. This will add an inline style, which will overwrite the CSS. And .color, so we're going to change the text color to red. And our message container itself, we want to change the style as well. And we're going to give this a border color. So make sure that you use a capital C for color. That's also going to be equal to red. And we can save that now and check it out. So you see now everything's blank. If I click register, you can see that we changed the text down here. It now says, please fill out all fields. The text is red and the border is red as well. Okay, so you see that we didn't have the pop-ups here. That's because we have our no validate going. So that shows kind of how you can have your validation 100% in your JavaScript and ignore the built-in HTML validation. But for me personally, I'm going to restore the validation on the HTML side because specifically it helps out a lot with the password validation because it will show that helpful pop-up message that will tell us the exact format our password needs to be. All right, speaking of passwords, in the next video, we're going to go over our password validation as well as storing our data. I'll see you in that one. Bye for now. Alrighty, welcome back. So the goal of this video is going to be to validate our passwords and store our data. So we're going to start with dealing with the passwords. So as I said before, the problem with the HTML validation is as long as both of these inputs follow the rules, we can enter two different passwords. But that defeats the purpose of confirming your password. We want them to have to be the same in order to actually submit the form and store our data. So we're going to jump back into our JavaScript, and we're going to start out by creating a global variable here. And this is going to be a let again. The reason we're using lets and not constants is because these values are going to change. So I'm going to create passwords match. This is going to be a Boolean again. And this is also going to start out as false. And now we're going to work in our validate form function. So we actually needed to wrap this in an if statement, which I forgot to do. We're going to have an if statement here. So if it is not valid, so meaning if is valid is false, we're going to wrap that in an if statement. And then below this, we are going to comment out another title. And this is to check to see if passwords match. And we're going to create another if statement. In this case, we're going to have password 1L dot value. And if it is equal to password2 value, so we're going to use 3 equal signs to represent equal, password2 value. So if they're equal, then they match. So then we want to do something. We want to set the passwords match Boolean to be equal to true. And we also want to style our password1L style border color to be equal to green. And we can copy this and paste it below. And we're just going to change the number here, password2L. Scroll down a bit. Okay. And we're going to have an else. So if the password values do not match, then we're going to set the passwords match Boolean to be equal to false. And then we want to provide a message in our message at the bottom here. So message.textContent is going to be equal to single quotes, make sure passwords match, period, semicolon. And then we're also going to change the color of the text. So style.color equals red. And then again, we want to change the message container style.border color. That's also going to be equal to red. And we also want to make sure that the password elements themselves have the correct border color, which is also going to be equal to red. And we can copy this and we can paste this below. And we're going to change the number there to be password 2L. And that's about it. So we can save that and check it out. Okay, so we're going to fill out the form with our valid items here. And we're going to go down now to our create password. And we're going to put in, again, our password, capital P1. And then in the next one, password, capital P, but number 2. You can see that it turned green here. But now if we actually click on register, you can see that the fields turn back to red. And we have a message here now at the bottom. Make sure passwords match. That's also in red. Excellent. Now we want to change our message to be a green success message if we filled out everything correctly. So we'll jump back to our code and take care of that. So we only want our success message to happen if our passwords match is true and if our is valid is true as well. So we're going to add another if statement here. And so we'll comment out a title first, actually. So this is going to be if form is valid and passwords match. Then we're going to have our if statement, if is valid. So we can just have it as is valid. That'll stand for is valid equals true. That's a short form for that. And same thing, we can just have our passwords match. So we want both of these things to be the case. We're going to use a double and sign here for that. And in this case, we are going to have our message.textContent equal to successfully registered, capital letters, or exclamation mark. And then we're going to have our message.style.color. So our text color is now going to be green. And then we're going to have our message container. Our style is going to be on our border color specifically, and we're going to make that green as well. Okay, so we can save that now and check it out. So we'll fill out our form again. This time we're just going to put in a matching password, so password 1, and we're going to click register, and you can see that we successfully have our message here and it's green. All right, that is perfect. So one other thing to consider in the way we've built out our validation method is we want to be able to save some processing time. So if we are already failing at this first check, we don't want to run the rest of this code. So we can accomplish that by adding in a return statement at the end of this if statement. So that means it will break out of this function and just stop doing what it's doing. And we can also add one after to see if our passwords don't match. We can have another return statement, meaning that we don't need to further check if it's valid and the passwords match because we already know that the passwords don't match. So we can save that, jump back, and now I'm actually going to show you another part of the DevTools, which is the Sources tab. So within this Sources tab, we can actually see our JavaScript here. It's very small, of course, but the main thing we're concerned about is our return statement here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a number of breakpoints. So if I click over here to the right of the number, you can see we have a red dot here. That's equal to a breakpoint, meaning that the code will stop executing on that line until I click to resume it. So I'm going to put a couple here, and I'm just going to put one below the return statement just to show you exactly what's happening. So I'm going to jump back as well to the HTML, and I'm going to turn off validation just to show you more clearly what's happening here. So I'm going to leave everything blank, which we know will return the value of not being valid. Let's make this just a little bit bigger. And so if I do that, register, you can see that it's paused on the breakpoint, and we have a play button here. And I can actually hover over to see the value of certain things. So we can see that is valid is false. And then if I press this, go to the next line, and then the next line, and then the next line. So the idea is by having this return statement, we are not going to execute the rest of this code, meaning we're not going to hit this breakpoint. And if we play that, we can see that we've gone back to normal and we did not hit the breakpoint. So we can also use this to modify our code. So I'm going to do that and get rid of the return statement there. And I'm going to make sure that I'm going to save this within the script.js here. You can see it has an exclamation mark to say that you've changed this file, but it's not saved in the code itself, which is fine because we do want our return statement, obviously. But you see now, if this time when I run it, paused here, and I scroll through, pause there, but because I don't have the return statement, if I keep going, you see it's going into the next if statement, even though it shouldn't have to because we've already determined that it's not valid. So that is the benefit of having a return statement. It allows you to break out of a function. Okay, cool. So that was a nice explanation of that. We'll switch that back to the console. And actually, before we do that, let's actually get rid of all these breakpoints because we don't want it to keep pausing on our code here. And we'll go back to the console and we'll just refresh the page. And we can make this a little less wide. Doesn't need to be that wide. And we'll jump back to our HTML. We'll remove our no validate again, save that. Alrighty, so the last thing we want to do now is we want to store our data from each of our input fields. So if we go back to the browser and back to this resource that we went to before about our input element, we can see that we are missing our name. So we want to have a name because this will store the submitted form data in a name value pair. So we're going to jump back to our HTML and we're going to add a name for each of these. So for this, I'm going to add it, I guess, just after the placeholder. So we're just going to type name. And this name actually is also going to be name. This name is going to be phone. And I'll put this one here after our required. This name is going to be email. And this name is going to be website. And then for our passwords, we actually only need one of them because they're both going to be the same value. So I'm going to add this onto our confirm password. So we're going to give this one the name of password, and we're not going to add a name to the first password field. So we can save that now. And now we're going to create our second function here. So we're going to create it right above our process form data function. And this one is going to be called store form data, bracket, curly brackets. And inside of this, we are going to create an object, a user object. So const user equals, and then curly brackets, enter, and then we'll add the semicolon at the end there. And so we want to assign the key and then the value. So the value is going to be form.name.value. So that's how we're going to target each of these. And instead of a semicolon at the end, they'll all have a comma at the end. So we're going to do the similar process, form.phone.value, comma, and then email is going to be form.email.value. And then website is going to be form.website.value, comma. And then the last one is going to be our password, which is going to be form.password.value. And then in the end, we'll comment out a title. You're going to do something with user data. So for our purposes, I'm just going to console log it. But of course, in a real application, you would do something with this object, like passing it to a server, to a database, etc. Lastly, we need to add this function to be called within our process form data function, but we only want to submit our data if valid. So we're going to have an if statement here. So if is valid and passwords match, so same as above, then we're going to call our function store form data. Okay, so let's save that and check it out. All right, so we're going to fill everything out properly here. And we're going to have our password, password1 with a capital P, and we're going to confirm it, password, let's just say password2. So technically the form is valid, but the passwords don't match. So you can see everything's green. We register, we can see, make sure the passwords match, but more importantly, we can see that we have not submitted the data. But if we change this number from 2 to 1, and we click register, you can see now our passwords match, we've successfully registered, and in our console, we have our object with all of our information. Alrighty, so that's it for the functionality of this project. I hope you learned a lot along the way about form validation, and I hope that you can use this within a project of your very own in the future. All right, I'll see you in the next project. Bye for now.
All right. Another project done. And in this one, I really want to talk about an important topic, which is passwords. Passwords are important. You never want to share your secrets with others. Don't trust anybody, right? So let's have a look at the code and talk about some of the best practices. So over here where we say store form data is where we grab all the information from the form and do something with it. Usually what we would do is send it to a server. Send it so that the information can be stored so that when a user comes back, we're able to check, hey, this is the user, is this their password? So most of the time we'll see the store form data being sent over the wire, over internet to a server that is protected, which means that it doesn't have open access where you can just search it or grab it through a browser. But let's talk about the most important information. Sure, name, phone, email might be sensitive, but the most important one is password. You don't necessarily want your password flying around the internet so that anybody could see it. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that I've filled in the information. If I open up the developer tools and go to console, if I hit register here, you'll see that I get the information of what I filled in, but also my password. As you can see, it's super secure. No, not really. Even though these dots appear, at the end of the day, this is just visual things that the browser adds. But if, let's say, an attacker had access to the same browser that I do, they can just easily see my password. Now, most of the time, that's fine because if you're the one on this browser typing in the information, well, then you have access to that computer and it's not a big deal. But the next steps are what's important. This information needs to get sent to a server somewhere in the world, to, let's say, Facebook or Instagram or Google. How can I send this information securely from my browser, from my computer that I have full control over, to somewhere across the world? Well, there's a few things that we want to do. One is we want to make sure that this information is encrypted. And the way we do that is using HTTPS. Now, for example, here I have the live version of the website using GitHub Pages. As you can see before, this was just a file that I opened on my computer. But if we put this page online, we'll actually have a URL that we can access this information from. And you'll notice here that there's a lock if you're using Google Chrome. This shows us that the connection is secure. Now, this lock means that we're using HTTPS. So there's two versions here. This is a protocol that allows us to communicate over the wire, over internet. There's HTTP or HTTPS. And HTTPS is the secure version. This means that when I send this information to a server, it's going to be encrypted. So if somebody intercepts that message somehow, they can't really read it because it's encrypted. So when we're sending form data to a server, we always want to make sure we're using HTTPS. And generally, if you're ever writing information to a website and logging in or putting in your password or putting in any sensitive information, you always want to make sure that they're using HTTPS. If they're just using HTTP, then most likely that website is not secure and you don't want to fill in any form data yourself. So that's step one. And luckily, GitHub Pages gives you HTTPS by default. So once we transfer this information, we go from form, we send it to a server, we then store that information on the server securely. Now, because this is a front-end JavaScript course, we're not going to get too deep into this topic, but usually what happens is once we send that information using something like a post request, so we can use a fetch post request to contain this information inside of a body of data that we transfer to the server that's encrypted because of HTTPS. The server receives this information. Remember that the server is something owned by, let's say, a company that you trust, like Facebook. Well, Facebook is a bad analogy for that one, but let's say Google or Facebook, they own those servers and they don't give access to anybody in the world to those servers. So once they get your password, they're going to do something called hashing, which makes it impossible for people to see what your password is and store that information in their databases. So when it comes to front end and best practices with password, your job as a front-end JavaScript developer is to make sure that whatever password the user chooses is a strong password with good conditions like capital letters or the length of the password. So your job is to make sure that whatever the user sends over the wire is as secure as possible. So step one is making sure that the password entered by the user is a complex one, not something simple, so that we get that red highlighting when the password is too simple or too short. But also to make sure that when we send over sensitive data, we use HTTPS. Now, I'll leave some resources for you to check out on this topic because it's really, really interesting. But I remember when I got started, I was always afraid of handling delicate user information. It's very hard when you're just starting out to know what is right, what is good. But if you remember what I just told you here and read some of these resources I'll attach, then you're good. Then you're storing your password or user passwords safely. Hopefully, this makes you a little bit more confident capturing that sensitive user data. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.